Ladies and gentlemen, welcome. Put your phones down, your books to the side. The next hour and a half is going to be a very special event. My name is Leonard Bernardo with the Open Society Foundations, and this is an event that we are doing in concert with Jacobin. It features the inimitable, irrepressible writer, critic, scholar, Evgeny Morozov, to focus on his 9-part podcast, The Santiago Boys, which if you haven't yet imbibed, I commend you to it quickly. It's something quite stupendous. But Evgeny is going to, with the support of Jordana Timmerman, here especially for this event from Buenos Aires, Argentina, herself a writer and journalist, they're going to look through and discuss and think about what the Santiago Boys, which is basically a revisionist history and critique of the Allende period in Chile, what it's all about. So on, of course, the 50th anniversary of the coup in Chile, the time has never been more propitious to have this conversation. So I welcome my friends, my colleagues, Evgeny Morozov and Jordana Timmerman.
All right, yeah, it's green now. Excellent. Well, thank you, Lenny, and hi, everyone. Thank you so much for coming. As Lenny said, it's the 50th anniversary since the coup, so there are a lot of reasons to re-examine that period. What I think I'm going to do today, since it's not a usual format to be telling such a long and to some extent esoteric story in the form of a podcast, what I would want to do today is to walk you through a little bit about my personal story of how I got to this storyline, but also how I got to this format. Because I think at the end of the day, I mean, I will talk a little bit towards the end about the broader lessons of Allende's experiments and with cybernetics and his experiments with computing, and of course the broader significance of the intellectual frameworks of the period, whether it's dependency theory or structural economics. But I think it's also important to understand the opportunities that the podcasting forum gives us to tell complex narratives and to tell them with not just audio and the sound, but also supporting materials. There is a very complex website that goes together with the series. So what I would like to give you today is both a personal story of my own work on this very complex project that took 2 years and 200 interviews, and also to give you more of the kind of analytical historical insights. For those of you who haven't heard the podcast, maybe we'll start just by me playing the video version of the trailer. So there is an audio version, which is 2 minutes and something, and there is a shorter video version, which has essentially some images of one of the most significant parts of that cybernetic legacy, the so-called operations room of Project Cybersyn. We'll talk about it later on, but I think just to give you some grounding in what it is about, I'll just play this trailer, and then I'll play also a few teasers as I talk and explain to you the podcast itself. So here goes the trailer.
This is the untold story of the Santiago Boys, a story that will get you to rethink everything you know about technology and politics, a story that will leave you asking, what if?
So we had this room, no paper, all automatic, all screens.
Decades before big tech stole our future, these rebellious engineers dreamt of a different digital universe.
And it looked like what you see in the films. It was attractive.
Imagine a world where technology serves the people, not corporations. Where big data helps democracy, not ruins it. A place where the impossible almost becomes possible.
In Latin America, you could dream of a utopia. my sensation when I was sitting there, I said, okay, this is like a game.
The ideas were bold, their goals noble, but as their dream is about to become reality, powerful forces crush it.
So it's just a 1-minute trailer. On the website. So as I said, maybe I'll. What? Oh, it's on? Yeah. Sorry, it's off. Sorry, yeah, now it should be better. So as I said, it's just a shorter version, and there is a longer version online that you can hear. It's not exactly clear why somebody from Belarus who's living in the south of Italy would take on this very ambitious 2-year project to begin with. So I think I owe you an explanation at the start. I was living my very nice intellectual rustic life in a Calabrian village surrounded by goats and fig trees and other animals when I got a call from a bunch of Italians who asked me if I would be interested in taking on a podcasting project with a hopeful cinematographic afterlife. So they were really interested in finding projects that could eventually become feature films and not documentaries. And they gave me this carte blanche, so to say, to find a project of interest. And foolishly, I thought that this would be an easy story to tell with a lot of dramatic and other potential. And essentially, I knew about the story because there is, as you probably know, a very interesting and well-researched academic book about it by Eden Medina called Cybernetic Revolutionaries. I wrote about the book in the New Yorker back in 2014. So, and to do that piece, I've traveled to the archives of the main character involved in the story. You can see him here with a beard, Stafford beer. And essentially, I thought, because I've also done some interviews and I've done some other research for it, I thought that I had all the main ingredients to tell the story. So I accepted this task. I must say that if you've read my writings, you probably know me as somebody who writes a lot about technology, and politics and economics. But I do that from a very analytical perspective. So most of my essays, they are quite heavy and analytical, and which makes for great reading if you love New Left Review. But it's not exactly dramatic storytelling. Which is a shortcoming that I wasn't aware of before I started this project. So as I took this on, my initial plan was just to interview a lot of people who were involved in the project, interview a lot of academics, historians, politicians from that era, and I thought that miraculously somehow all of that would add up to a story. That, as I discovered, didn't happen as easily. Having spent a year interviewing people, and I interviewed about 100 people in a year, I had production teams helping me on the ground in Chile and Argentina and Brazil and a few other places and in the UK. I was still very far from producing a story that was coherent and was not just a collection of essays stitched together in an audio form. Of course, if you think about the nature of the project at the heart of the podcast, the so-called Project Cybersyn, you would probably understand why I faced that challenge. So Project Cybersyn was if you've seen some articles about that period of Chilean history, for example, 2002 piece in The Guardian, 2008 piece in the New York Times, they often refer to Project Cybersyn as socialist internet. I think it's a bit of a misnomer, but essentially what that project aspired to do was very logical. Allende, as part of his broad transformative agenda for the Chilean economy, wanted to nationalize a lot of enterprises. Big enterprises, some of them used to belong to foreign companies, but he wanted to essentially integrate them into the state sector of the economy. That was in line with what various economists, leftist economists, were preaching at the time. It was very much in line with dependency theory. It was very much in line with what economists at CEPAL, a very important economic commission for Latin America based in Santiago, was recommending. The problem was that, of course, the Unidad Popular government didn't have enough managers to run all those enterprises. And moreover, as part of its radical agenda, it also wanted to involve workers in the governance of the enterprises. So the agenda was complicated also by that factor, because a lot of workers didn't have any managerial experience whatsoever. Thirdly, there were also efforts, of course, to make Allende's governance and life miserable, some of them coming from the local opposition in the face of industrialists and oligarchs and right-wing movements like Patria y Libertad, but some of it coming from the United States. For example, shortly before Allende assumed presidency, but after he was elected, the American ambassador at the time was already brainstorming about how they can facilitate the exit of managers from Allende's Chile so that to deprive the popular unity of the ability to govern. Right, so there were sustained efforts by foreign actors, most of them in the US, to essentially deprive what seemed like a relatively coherent but well-managed technocratic project of Unidad Popular of like the main technocratic cadres or administrators. So the insight that one of Allende's junior technocrats, a guy called Fernando Flores, who appears quite a lot in the podcast, you don't see a big picture of him, but he's sitting in the center in that drawing, and I can show you him here wearing a sweater on the right. He essentially came up with this brilliant idea to go to the United Kingdom and talk to what was at the time one of the leading management theorists, a guy called Stafford Beer, about how they can solve this problem of needing to run and manage hundreds of enterprises that became part of the state, but lacking the human capacity and human managers to do that. And of course, Stafford Beer recommended him a solution, which was to bring himself to Chile and become a consultant to the Chilean government. And as part of that, he designed a system which, instead of leveraging the missing human component of the management system, they would leverage the power of computers, the power of the telex network that connected the data coming from the factories that were being nationalized, and it would integrate also the local knowledge of the workers who knew about how every of the factories that were being nationalized worked. So essentially, rather than speaking of a socialist internet, here to be more correct to speak about socialist artificial intelligence of some kind, because the idea was to essentially build a model of every factory by reducing it to most important processes that were happening there. So you could identify 8 or 9 or 10 indicators of most important activities that determine the productivity of the factory. So you can monitor, for example, the rates of absenteeism, or how frequently supplies are delivered with a delay, for example, right? And you do that by talking to the workers. You do that by talking to the people who know how each factory works. You reduce it to the basic logical model of a factory, and then you start monitoring each of these indicators, right? And as you monitor these indicators over time, you are able to essentially leverage the tools of statistical prediction and statistical analysis to understand whether there are some problems that are emerging on the horizon. And you are able to differentiate, again, by using statistics, within problems that are not really problems, they're just random noise signals in the data, from problems that are genuinely representative of something going wrong. So Stafford Beer's solution was essentially to have real-time, or as much to real-time as it could get, data from each of the factories participating in the project be sent to a central computer in Santiago, have the data analyzed there, and then have the data essentially, if the problems were identified in it, inform the participating factories that they need to step in and solve something with the factory before it becomes a national crisis. Right? So the idea was to leverage, as I said, all sorts of technical infrastructures, devices, modeling the network and the computer in order to understand how you can manage the public sector and the country better. So that was the initial project. And of course, to sell this idea to the local ministers and administration, and also to explain it to the workers themselves, Stafford Beer came up with this idea of building the so-called, of building the so-called operations room.
This is the untold story.
Let me see if we are going. I'll just close the. Sorry. I'll just show you the picture of the operations room, which some of you may have seen. Okay, if you will probably get dizzy with this one. Let me show you a better one. So this. So to sell this idea to the general public and to sell it, of course, to Allende himself and to the politicians from Chile, the idea was to build an operations center, a room of some kind where a lot of this data related to the Chilean economy would come in almost in real time. You would have interfaces built into chairs that would allow you to navigate what's happening on the screens, and you would be able essentially to circumvent some of the problems that arise, for example, from the lack of training in the workers themselves. Because the idea was that by leveraging this power of visuality, you would be able to communicate to the workers things that they would otherwise not necessarily understand as they assume these managerial positions, because they didn't have background in accounting or they didn't have background in management. So the idea was to precisely kind of leverage this power of interfaces to communicate the most important findings of the system to people who would actually be taking decisions. So as I've explained to you, this technical nature of Project Cybersyn, that essentially was my brief. It was to look at this highly technical system for managing the Chilean economy and try to present it in the most dramatic manner possible. So after 1 year and 100 interviews, as I've said, I discovered that I was far from succeeding in that task. And 1 year in, I essentially understood several things about this project that were not clear to me before. First of all, of course, it's highly technical, and it's sometimes hard to explain the complexity of all the statistical techniques involved and the way in which computers were integrated in all of this. Second thing that I discovered is that the project was actually far from ever being used as intended. So this room that I'm showing you, it was a nice prototype. It was not actually ever connected to the Chilean industry as such. So they had some data for presentation purposes that were fed into the system manually, but this room was not a space where decisions were taken. Some of the modeling and communication of data from the enterprises to the ministry and from the ministry back to the enterprises did happen. But again, it was not exactly the dramatic story of Allende building a secret weapon with which to take on his opponents from a Star Wars-like, interface or a room, or an operations headquarters. So then I discovered that the internal Chilean bureaucracy itself, the parts of the government that were not exactly on the cutting edge politically or technologically, were also far from being enthusiastic about this project. What happened is that the Chilean technocrat who started it all, Fernando Flores, that I showed you before, he partly as a result of this project, and partly because he was just a very smart and intelligent man, he rose through the ranks of the Chilean government very quickly. So a year into the project, he essentially became the Minister of the Economy, and a few months later, he became Minister of Finance, which basically deprived the project of its key benefactor inside the Chilean government, which set the project on a very shaky ground because they couldn't obtain the kind of resources and attention and political capital that the project required. So I discovered that there were extra complications in the story, and the story was not really a political thriller of any kind, but it was more of a drama of a project where Stafford Beer, the guy who you saw, who is the mastermind of it all, essentially takes a huge bet on a project in a foreign country that he had never visited. He didn't know much about socialism or Latin America before. He goes there on what he thinks is a consulting project. He falls in love with Latin America and socialism and gradually radicalizes himself and takes a public position in Britain advocating for Allende and advocating for the project, only to see that the Chilean bureaucracy actually comes to hate him and they don't want the project to continue, and he becomes a public opponent of the Chilean bureaucracy itself, the very people who invited him to Chile and are paying his bills. Right? So the story became, for me, more of a drama, but it still was nowhere near cohering into a dramatic narrative of any kind. So after I've spent the first year producing 5 or 6 versions of the first 3 or 4 episodes, I shared them with my Italian colleagues who had background in screenwriting and screenplay writing and basically cinema. And they all said that, well, this is all very interesting and has a lot of esoteric detail about Chilean history and economy and Cold War, but it's essentially nothing that could be filmable and nothing that could ever become an actual dramatic project, which was a little bit discouraging a year in. So what I did then, having understood that the project is not at all what I thought it was, and knowing that there is actually an excellent academic book already telling its history in an academic manner, and I didn't want to repeat what is already in the book, I decided to do something radical and basically take 3 months off working and researching and interviewing people and go through as many books on dramatic storytelling as I could find. So that was the time where I would read 60, 70 books on dramatic storytelling, character arcs, screenplay writing that you normally read if you work in Hollywood. And those were 3 very interesting but also very boring months where I would also watch a lot of films and read their screenplays and try to reverse engineer how drama actually works. Which, you know, for somebody who normally writes New Left review essays is not exactly a trade you can recycle or reuse afterwards, but I decided that it was a project worth pursuing. So after I've done that, I began to understand the problems with the story as it's traditionally told from the dramatic perspective. And it became clear to me that there are many elements in the story that are missing to make it really exciting. I mean, it does have a lot of fascinating characters. Stafford Beer is one of them. Fernando Flores and his afterlife in Silicon Valley, which you hear about in the podcast, is another. But there were a lot of elements missing to really captivate the audience and do it over 7, 8, or 9 episodes in such a way that I would also be able to have enough space as an intellectual and as a thinker in my own right, and not just a podcaster, to share my own reflections on what it is to be learned from that experience, what's the relevance of Project Cybersyn for debates about, you know, big data and socialism today. So I couldn't just pack it all in 3 episodes and tell a story of a fantastic project becoming essentially a victim of the Chilean bureaucratic system. So this is so we're talking about 15 months in, I understood that the real genre that I was working in was not documentary, it was not history, it was rather narrative nonfiction. And I didn't know much about narrative nonfiction. I mean, I knew, of course, about, you know, great works of American literary journalism written in the 60s and 70s, you know, Capote and many others in True Blood, but that was not exactly relevant to telling a story about the Cold War in Latin America. And then I discovered that the genre of narrative nonfiction, whereby, you know, you try to tell the story of what actually happened in a historical setting or a historical event of some kind, but you do that without fictionalizing anything, but you still do that in a highly dramatic manner, was actually invented in Latin America by Rodolfo Walsh, a very interesting Argentinian writer with a very strong political commitment, who also died a tragic death as Argentina turned violent itself in the mid-70s. And he wrote a fascinating book that I can highly recommend called Operation Massacre, which tells a story of a real event from Argentinian history. And that got me thinking about the fact that perhaps what I'm working on is narrative nonfiction, and it's just missing a couple of elements in the story at the level of the subplot or at the level of character development, which did not surface in the interviews that I've made. Because, again, I conceived of this as a story of Project Cybersyn, but the real drama of the story did not necessarily relate just to the project. It related to the broader Allende experience, right? And once I understood that the real drama kind of surpasses and goes far beyond the story of the project, I managed to conceive the right subplots, the right characters, and the right storylines. And I understood that the way to tell the story in a truly dramatic manner is through research. Right? But it's research not for the kind of details that would, I don't know, tell us something more about Stafford Beer or Salvador Allende, and I've done that kind of research, but it's a story of finding storylines that in a way dramatize and add antagonism to the story where antagonism is currently missing. Right? And as you think about antagonism, for example, you really need to think about who are your protagonists, right? If your protagonists are just Stafford Beer and Fernando Flores, then you're very limited in terms of the kind of conflicts and antagonisms that you are able to depict in the drama. So I had, for example, to center the story and to start it with the story of Salvador Allende himself. And it might seem obvious in retrospect, but it's not obvious in most existing accounts of Project Cybersyn, because they really tell it as a story of Unidad Popular government doing something, as opposed to the story of them being forced to do it, because ultimately they have a big project and their adversaries are making it impossible to implement it. So I'll play you a little teaser. This is how the podcast starts. It starts with the story of ITT, a tech company that, in a sense, doesn't have much to do with Project Cybersyn as such, but it has everything to do with understanding the challenges that Allende was facing at the beginning of his administration, because ITT essentially tried to engineer a coup. Well, not an engineer coup, but they tried to prevent him from getting elected. And once he got elected, they tried to collaborate with the CIA to make sure that he doesn't get confirmed. And once he got confirmed and became president, they did their best to weaken him. Right? And for me, the story of ITT was a way of both making the story, the broader story, relevant to the contemporary dilemmas and contemporary problems that we in our day have with regards to big tech, but it was also a way of dramatizing the antagonism in a way that the usual story of Project Cybersyn doesn't. So just again, to give you a slight idea of what's in the podcast, I'll play you this teaser, and this is how the podcast itself starts. So this is the first minute or two of the first episode.
It's an unusually warm, quiet night in late September. It's been just a few weeks since 9/11, but it's not the 9/11 you're probably thinking of. The original 9/11. The day of Chile's brutal military coup. The coup that cost Salvador Allende his life, and Chile its precious democracy. The coup of 1973. As with the other 9/11, our story starts in New York. And yes, a huge explosion looms large on the horizon. Someone has just phoned the New York Times about a bomb, and it's ticking in the very heart of Manhattan. The target is ITT, a mighty tech giant with links to the CIA and the military. A company almost universally disliked. A company whose Chilean holdings were nationalized by Allende. They hated him for it. And now that he's dead, someone must be taking revenge. But who? Minutes go by, then hours. Perhaps it was just a prank call. Perhaps ITT would not have to pay for its sins in Chile after all. Perhaps they'll get away with it. But then, at 5:40 in the morning, things do take a turn for the worse. Boom. The explosion that shakes Madison Avenue marks a tragic end to Allende's ambitious agenda. His bold efforts to reclaim technology have failed. And Chile paid dearly for his democratic vision. A vision that we're still missing today, and badly so. Welcome to the Santiago Boys, a podcast with a...
Okay, so I'll stop here. But essentially, as you can hear, even in this segment, it's a story of a real explosion in New York. I was fortunate through a lot of research to stumble upon an article in the New York Times that described it. And for me, it's the kind of detail that led me to conceptualize a whole entire subplot in the story, illustrating the way in which Allende took on ITT, and ITT in a way took on Allende, which later helped me conceptualize and arrive to a much bigger analytical schema that gave the podcast its name, the Santiago Boys. And I'll get to that in a second, but it's a nice illustration of just how different subplots that I had to insert into the podcast allow to create the drama, in this case, the antagonism between a big American corporations working with the CIA and Salvador Allende, that helps us also to present Project Cybersyn in a somewhat different light. Because the whole point of Project Cybersyn was to create stability in a country that was being destabilized from both within and from without. Right? And again, it's not the usual story that we hear, because it's very easy to think about it as just a technocratic venture of essentially trying to run the public sector with more efficiency, right? And in the story that I'm telling, which I think is also an accurate reflection of the Unidad Popular experience, it's a very different type of exercise and a very different type of project. So to go back to my story and the challenges that I faced, so after 15 months and having read all these books, I understood that even though I've already interviewed some of the main participants 4 or 5 times, with this new dramatic focus, I have to remake and redo many of the interviews. So I spent the following 6 months doing another 100 interviews. So in the end, because clearly when you are trying to tell the story in a more documentary manner, the kind of questions you ask are very different from the questions that you ask if you're trying to really present it in a more dramatic light. So I had to go back, and with some of the people that appear in the podcast, I've done 7 or 8 interviews, right? Some of them going over an hour and 2 hours. It was a massive amount of work. But again, you see that that's the challenge of narrative nonfiction, where a normal screenwriter would just invent things, or they would invent characters, or they would invent events. My hands are tied in that the only way for me to do drama as prescribed by, Aristotle and dramatic handbooks is to essentially keep drilling and keep researching until I found enough dramatic material to weave it into a story. And it proved a huge challenge. It proved a huge challenge, but in the end, I think it worked. As I said, I had to completely rethink the way in which the podcast is presented. I had to center the story of the Santiago Boys as the opposition to the Chicago Boys that ruled the Chilean economy after Pinochet, as the main driving story, at least at the beginning of the podcast. I had to situate Allende much more thoroughly at the beginning to build up sympathy of the audience and the public to Allende's project overall, because at the end, if you don't care about Allende, there is no point to care about his cybernetic extravagant experiments, which made me, again, it unleashed me into researching all sorts of details about Allende himself. So I read every single Allende biography on the market. I read, witness accounts by his friends and his entourage and his colleagues. And at the end, I arrived to the most incredible, rich details. For example, one of the sideline stories that follows right after this explosion is what happens 9 months prior to this bomb, which is an encounter between Salvador Allende and George Bush Sr., which is a story I discovered, again, going through the archives related, of the State Department, essentially, because Bush wrote a very long memo about that meeting. And in that memo, you discover all sorts of fascinating details. What kind of Maoist jacket Allende was wearing at the time, how much whiskey with what kind of ice he took when they were meeting at Waldorf Astoria Hotel during the meeting of the UN General Assembly. And you discover, for example, that Allende did confront Bush about both the role of multinationals in weakening him and about the CIA. And again, drilling into memory accounts and witness accounts of that period, I unearthed the most fascinating details, which normally you would invent as a novelist or as a screenwriter, but I picked them up and lifted them from witness accounts. So there is a detail, for example, of Allende giving a speech at the United Nations and feeling pain in his recently bought shoes. And that's a story that comes from an account of somebody who was with him in New York and went to a store in Manhattan to buy shoes with Allende the day before his talk, and then having a conversation with Allende about those shoes. It's a trivial detail, but it immediately brings the whole scene to life in a way that you can do in a novel, but it's harder to do in a typical documentary. So long story short, as I was doing all these interviews and all this research, I stumbled upon a very interesting discovery, which was kind of at the back of my mind, but I never fully made sense of it. And it's the fact that in late 1960s, the student scene and the student life in Santiago essentially had three groups fighting each other on different sides and lines of the barricade. There were radical leftist or Christian democratic, let's put it that way, professionals, people studying engineering, students studying medicine, and some economics, but not a lot. And then you had the two more rightist groups. You had the so-called gremialistas, which were mostly law students who were advocating for a Franco-like authoritarian hierarchical society in Chile. And then you had the Chicago Boys, which were not known by that name at the time, at least not internationally, but those were right-wing economists who studied in Chicago or with professors who came from Chicago and were in Chile. And as I went through the story of this confrontation, which culminates in a big student occupation in Santiago in 1967 of the Catholic University, I understood that in a sense, it was these leftist professionals, the engineers and the doctors, who by and large enter the Allende administration after the 1970 election, and they're the ones who represent a very technologically savvy, radical agenda for transforming the country. So they are the people who basically read radical economics, they read dependency theory, they read a lot of texts written by Brazilians who are in Santiago at the time, whether it's Cardoso, who I think lives in 68, 69, but there were many others. There was Mauro Marini, there was Teotonio dos Santos, there were many others, some of whom also involved with the Allende government as it took office. And what I understood is that in a certain sense, this cohort of people reading radical economics, thinking about questions of productivity and technology, they do cohere into a school of thought of some kind. They are all connected to, in some way, directly or indirectly, to CEPAL, this commission for Latin America that I mentioned. They're all reading similar texts, and they have a very coherent story of what technology is. And it's not the story that you hear in the mainstream Chicago account of the story, right? For them, technology is a force of power. It's highly geopolitical. The countries of the global north, or as they would call them back then, of the core, have the most advanced technologies. And as societies industrialize, the technologies become even more advanced. And the dependence that the countries of the periphery, or as we'll call them today, the global south, develop, gets stronger and stronger. So the critique that this, as I call it later, I don't call it like this in the podcast, but I call it, following this description in the essays that I wrote afterwards, this Santiago School of Technology develops. It's a very contemporary, relevant account of how technology is an instrument of inequality in the international system, and it's essentially a lens on other parts of the Allende agenda with regards to technology that are still relevant today. Because it's not just that they were nationalizing these enterprises to integrate them into the public sector and run them better by using cybernetic software from a dedicated ministry. They were also trying to industrialize heavily, right? They were trying to catch up. Allende had a vision of building even semiconductor factories in the north of the country. They started that. They had public companies that essentially were leading work in computerization and industrialization of Chile, precisely with an agenda that today we would call technological autonomy and technological sovereignty, where the idea was to essentially free and emancipate and liberate Chile from dependence on technologies that were coming from the United States, but also Germany and a few other countries, and to have robust domestic alternatives that would allow it to pursue an independent economic agenda, but also avoid the dependence and all the costs associated with intellectual property, patents, copyrights, and so forth that come with dependence on foreign technology. And as I understood that, talking to one of the main people involved in the occupation of '67, and then who occupied a very important position related to planning in the Allende government, I understood that ultimately, if you look at the story today, that's the part of the narrative that is worth remembering, possibly even more than the story of Project Cybersyn. So what I ended up doing was using Project Cybersyn as a backbone for telling several stories, most of which cohere and converge on the story of the Santiago Boys as a kind of metaphorical, allegorical counterpart to the story of the Chicago Boys. So in the story that I'm telling, the Chicago Boys are essentially a very ideationally poor response to a much more radical project led by technocrats and engineers with a very different vision for technology. Right? As I've said, for the Chicago school, technology has its own autonomous logic. It's just a consequence of science and innovation, and there is no geopolitical component to it of any kind. There is no inequality in the world system that determines how it's being adopted, who adopts it. For the Chicago version of neoliberalism, none of that is a factor worth pondering. And what I discovered is that perhaps it would be possible to tell the story in this way, and that's what I did. And ultimately, for a lot of people involved in Project Cybersyn, it's been not necessarily the most pleasant experience, because some of them have given to me 10, 15, 20 hours of their life, because I've interviewed some of them 8 or 9 times, only to discover that for them, the project itself and its history and its identity and everything else is somewhat sidelined. Right? And I don't think that that's the correct interpretation of what I've done, but nonetheless, it's a possible critique that I'm also happy to discuss. At the end of the day, I mean, I don't have a lot of time, and I want to also have a discussion with Jordana and then open up for questions. I did end up dramatizing the main characters, which I've said is not just Stafford Beer, who has a completely unbelievable arc of his own. You would almost wish to have a character like Stafford Beer in your film, on your novel, because he really goes from being one of the good chums and friends with Robert Maxwell, Ghislaine's father, and like living in a villa with 8 kids and a pool and a Rolls Royce, to essentially becoming a hippie socialist after the Chilean experience and moving into an isolated cottage in the middle of a forest in Wales where he didn't even have running water, right? And that happens in the span of 3 years. And I think if you look at the pictures of Stafford Beer before he goes to Chile, which is, you can see this very imposing, serious man with a cigar, and Stafford Beer just a year after the Chilean coup, you see the character arc that is pretty impressive. Similar things happen to Fernando Flores, but in the opposite direction. So Fernando Flores starts, again, just to remind you of what he looked like. I have a picture here, right? So Fernando Flores is this gentleman with the pullover. So this one. So he goes in almost the opposite direction. He starts as this radical technocrat reading dependency theory, and he quotes Che Guevara and Marx in his thesis, university thesis. He then is put in a series of prisons and concentration camps in Chile after the coup. He's with Allende during the bombing of La Moneda. But Fernando, after this experience, resurfaces in California, does a PhD at Berkeley with John Searle and Herbert Dreyfus, and becomes this Heideggerian critic of artificial intelligence and computer systems, out of which, remarkably, he builds a very lucrative consulting practice becomes a millionaire in California and teams up with a very important figure in American computer science called Terry Winograd, who later becomes the mentor to Larry Page and a lot of other luminaries in Silicon Valley. And basically, Fernando becomes the millionaire consultant thinking about Heidegger and artificial intelligence and not much about Allende or Che Guevara. So the story of these two is extremely important. I trace its development over 2 or 3 decades. And, to do that in a podcast where the main event is 1973 coup was not easy, because I had to find a way to keep the story going for another 2 or 3 episodes to tell the story of this two. And that's why I have to tell the story of Operation Condor. I introduce a lot of Latin American history. In the end, I think the element that really made the story as dramatic as it had to be was, of course, the story of Allende, right? And the story of Allende and the debates around him, the debates he had with his own daughter, Beatriz, the tragedy of him knowing that the coup is inevitable and giving his papers to his son-in-law, who's a Cuban diplomat and spy in Santiago, to keep at the Cuban embassy, knowing that there will be a coup and they will probably come after his papers. I mean, that provides some of the extra drama which was missing in the story of Project Cybersyn itself. I think I've been talking for way longer than I thought, so I'll probably stop here. Again, just to give the happy end, I guess, to my own quest that took 2 years to do this. In the end, it all came together quite nicely. I think the story does seem to have the drama that it was missing. The opinions on it are controversial, depending on whom you ask, from the people who participated in it. But by and large, I've learned, I think, how to work with a genre and a medium, which, again, it's not normally used for telling stories that are both complex at the personal character level, but also complex in terms of Cold War history and historical discussions, right? And just to give you, again, a small teaser, I mean, the podcast does go on weird tangents which would not appear in the film or series or whatever will come out of it, because I tell the story of the 1954 coup in Guatemala. There is a story of the coup in Brazil. There is a story of Fidel Castro as a young lawyer taking on ITT, the big tech giant, and then nationalizing it as he comes to power. As I said, there is a story of Operation Condor. It's a way for me to use partly the story of a boring technocratic project and a very dramatic transformation of two people at its center to also feed some broccoli and, to feed some spinach or intellectual equivalent of it to people who would not otherwise know these parts of Latin American history, which I personally find interesting and still having something to teach us. So I think I'll stop here and I'll be more than happy to answer your questions. Thank you.
Thank you. That was a lot.
Podcast is 10 hours, so prepare yourself for 10 hours of
Yeah.
similar.
Serve yourself some red wine and empanadas to listen to it. It's a big theme in the podcast. And thank you. And what I love about that you chose to do this narrative history is that the intertwined stories and all the complexities sort of remind us that we are living in history and the relevance of this that happened to our current lives. It reminds us that history isn't just something that happened inevitably, as some Chilean apologists for the coup want us to believe, but it's intention and also accidents. And you sort of showed all of the forces that were acting in Chile at the time and how they used what they like to portray as this neutral tool, technology, with a lot of intention on both sides, and how the battle over that was hardly accidental but was very intentional. So I very much like the tools that you used and some of the details, like Beatriz outside of La Moneda beating the door to be allowed back in with her father. They really stay with you, and they impact the human side of the story. I really liked that. I had to take some notes because this was a lot. But I like that Cybersyn challenges that economic advance is purely something of the right wing, that the left can't think of ways to to develop and change the economy. What are some of the ways that this might be applicable for progressives now, the ways we might deploy technology for a progressive project?
Sure. Well, partly, there is towards the end of the podcast, I almost try to engage in a certain sociological or cultural reflection on how we remember this project, because in a sense, it's a project that didn't really work as intended, at least if you consider all the elements, including the operations room. But we somehow still want to believe that it did work, right? And we endow it with meaning, we endow it with certain aspirations and utopian longings about the current moment. But in a sense, having looked at the archives and the internal deliberations of the Chilean bureaucrats, the coup in a very weird way saved the project from its inevitable collapse under the weight of Chilean technocracy and bureaucracy, under Allende, right? Because it didn't have a very bright future beyond August 1973. And I point out to some correspondence that I found in the podcast itself, where one of the leaders of the project basically threatens the Chilean government and says, look, if you don't give us any more resources, we would shut it down, right? And weirdly, we remember it as a story of success of the Chilean state, right? And not a story that's much more ambiguous and much more complex and much more dramatic. That aside, having thought about this question of what's the relevance of the project for today, I do think that, and this is where I disagree with a lot of people who participated in the project, because at its heart is a theoretical masterpiece of Stafford Beer, this guy that I've shown you, the consultant. He developed what essentially is a theory of the firm, as we would describe it in economics, and it's a theory of how successful institutions work. He called it the viable systems model. And this viable system model is essentially a way of explaining how organizations that work effectively and survive turbulent challenges in the outside world, how they do that by structuring themselves into various departments, units, structuring information flows inside in a certain way. It's essentially a template that looks at both existing organizations and how they work and explains how they work and why they work. And it's also a way of building and designing organizations from scratch in such a way that they would still be open-minded and learn and do things differently and successfully and survive the challenges of a changing environment. So there are, of course, people who would look at Project Cybersyn and say, okay, well, that was an effort to run the Chilean economy, but the real heart of the project is this viable system model. And we can take it and we can apply it to any organization, Open Society Foundations, anything else, Google, Apple, you name it. And there are some people who are followers of Stafford Beer who have, for example, applied it to understand the famous bus cooperative Mondragon, right? So, there are people who actually, now they do it also with the British health system. They would apply to NHS. They would apply to try to understand what is missing in it. And there are people who genuinely believe that the viable system model is like a way of resolving all the problems of the world. So as long as we can restructure the United Nations to be more cybernetic as an institution, we would be able to resolve problems like climate change, hunger, and you name it. Of course, I'm kind of over-exaggerating here, but there are people who think that the real lesson of the project is this theoretical package we can just take out of the box and apply anywhere. My reading of this is that I feel a certain technocratic temptation in that project, because essentially, the real world is more complex, and there is a certain scientific attitude embedded in the celebration of the viable system model as a guide to transforming the world. And where I think the real relevance is in the motivation of the broader economic, technological, geopolitical project that led Allende to nationalize those companies. Right? And that project came out of dependency theory. It came out of a very different understanding of the role that technology plays in national development. And that's why the podcast is not called Stafford Beer in Chile or Project Cybersyn, the history. It's called the Santiago Boys, because I really mean that it's their presence and their thought and their activities that need to be excavated and contextualized in the proper intellectual and political context of the day to understand, what were Chilean designer. So I discovered, for example, the guy who designed the operations room is a German designer, Guy Bonsiep. I have a photo with him just taken a few weeks ago in Chile. This is him. very useful 87-year-old. So he, for example, was reading Andre Gunder Frank, the German dependency theorist in 1969, 1970. It's not a typical literature for a designer to be reading, right? And a lot of the reflections that then went into the operations room were reflections driven and stimulated by engaging with a certain theoretical, economic, intellectual literature, which I think bears rediscovering today. So in that sense, I know that my answer is dissatisfying to people who've built a little, I don't want to say cult, but a little following around CyberSyn, because they really think that it has the solutions. And I think that maybe it doesn't, and maybe that the real lessons of Project CyberSyn do have to do with CEPAL, do have to do with dependency theory, do have to do with Allende, and Stafford Beer was just the catalyst for it. A word of promotion for our friends from Jacobin who run a magazine by that name.
And I like that your project allows us to look at these issues of technology through a different lens, a bit like dependency theory shifts our paradigm of interpreting the economic realities. And it reminds me of a book from that period, How to Read Donald Duck, which teaches us about, or trains us to read cultural, Western culture as a proponent of a certain capitalistic system. And so it's not just something that is natural, it is something that is bringing us a theory and a vision. And I think a lot of what you're outlining is also the pushback that these challenges receive. And so that when you nationalize something and challenge the center, the colony, the empire, there's a pushback and it's very strong. And I was wondering what kind of pushback this project has received, what has been the reception of it, if there have been any challenges from the right or from...
Sure. So just to give you an idea of how much, let me backtrack a little bit. You know, there is this famous saying in Hollywood that the quality of a film is judged by the stuff that's left on the floor during the editing process. So just to give an idea of how much stuff still remains on the floor of the Santiago Boys, I actually did a 3-hour interview with the co-author of How to Read Donald Duck, Armand Matelar. I did ask Dorfman, but he didn't have time for me. And it never made it into the podcast, right? And that gives you an idea of just how hard it is to get to the heart of the drama, like how much extra stuff you need to do to get where I ended up getting. So there are 30 voices of other people that appear in the podcast, and there were more than 200 interviews, right? So you see the ratio is a little bit on the kind of crazy side. But to give you an answer, so Project CyberSyn first of all, it didn't have its name until relatively late into the game, right? It's not, this is, again, as somebody trained in history of science and technology, I also had to apply that lens because, you know, the typical popular framing of this would be to say, okay, there was Project CyberSyn, now let's tell its history. Just like people tell the history of the printed book, right? But of course, there was no Project CyberSyn at the beginning, just like there was no finished printed book to tell the history of. So there was an effort by Fernando Flores to go to London, speak to Stafford Beer, and ask him to send a student to help them. Right? And Stafford Beer said, no, forget my students, I will go myself. He goes there, he starts talking to them, gradually he drafts a plan, then that plan 6 months later acquires the name Project CyberSyn, and then it kind of slowly comes into place as an object, but it's not an object that has, you know, preconceived execution plan. And by object, I mean mostly sort of objects as they're sort of in history of science. So in that sense, there is no opposition to the project because nobody knows what the project is, at least at the beginning. There is no grand scheme to implement CyberSyn in Chile. Somebody leaks, well, Stafford Beer goes to the UK because, you know, he's a consultant. This is also a story that's very important to understand. For him, in 1972, 1971, this is the way to essentially finally get relevance. That's the guy who spends 1960s trying to convince the Labour Party to adopt all this stuff that Harold Wilson talks about in his famous White Heat of Technology speech of 1964. Beer has no success. Everybody, and I discuss it also in the podcast, he comes from a fancy family. His brother, Jan Beer, runs one of the fanciest schools in the country where all the elites are taught. So Stafford Beer technically can enter those corridors of power, but people mostly think that he's an eccentric. Right? He doesn't last in most of his jobs. He says what's on his mind. He has a lot of problem implementing his agenda for changing Britain cybernetically. What he finds in Chile is a chance to transform the country radically and then possibly use that experience elsewhere because he's a consultant. He'll then go to Yugoslavia or he'll go somewhere else. So he is public about the project. He gives presentations about the project in London. And this is where the British media got hold of it. And, the British, with their liberal sensibility to control centralization of computer power, reading a lot of George Orwell, they immediately present it as a big brother project by Allende to control the Chilean economy and everybody else in the country. And that sets the tone for the reception of the project in Britain and ultimately in the United States, because they endow it with the functions it never had. They completely overestimated what it was capable of, and they present it as a centralization of power by Allende. And I go into these discussions a little bit. I mean, it was, of course, centralized because they only had 2 computers to work with. They couldn't afford to have a computer in every factory to do the modeling, so they had to send the data to a central point. But there were other technocratic excesses in the project that I kind of criticize. But at the end of the day, the media reception of the project, which is also developing in Chile, because the Chileans, knowing that Chile is a complicated country where things don't work as easily as people from abroad think they do, they kind of never paid any attention to Project Cybersyn. But when the first articles in The Observer and other journals start coming out, the Chilean anti-Allende media turns them into like an attack on Allende. So they say, everything that we've been saying about Allende centralizing power and nationalizing the economy, it's true, and they have the secret room from which they're managing the entire economy. Right? And that becomes the context for the reception of the project. I think that possibly some of the stories were leaked by people involved in the project themselves at the higher level, because it made them look far more important than they were, because it really presented the project as the backbone of the Chilean socialism, while in fact it wasn't. So from that perspective, I think that it's very hard to draw concrete specific lessons from it, because it was very haphazard, right? It was very haphazard, and a lot of it was decisions taken as a response to things that shouldn't have happened, So it's Stafford Beer talking to the British media, it's Stafford Beer giving a big talk where he announces the project. Imagine, so this is a confrontational moment I describe a little bit in one of the episodes. Stafford Beer thinks that he will finally clear up all the confusion about the project in The Observer and other media by giving a big talk at Sussex, in Brighton, the radical kind of center of dependency theory and national innovation systems. So it's kind of the leftist hotbed. So he goes there, he gives a talk, and there is an advisor to the Chilean government, a lady who is a developmental economist working in the UK, sitting in the audience. She never heard about the project, so she gets up and says, well, this is all nonsense. It's like you are just giving us fake news. This project doesn't exist. Like, what you're saying here is just charlatanism. And that kind of reputation then follows Stafford Beer for a little bit, because there are consistently people and critics who say that all you're saying about this project cannot be true. So there is a guy, a very prominent American scientist, who writes a letter to the New Scientist, where there is some media coverage of Cybersyn saying that this project just technically is impossible. So what you're saying here, it doesn't exist. Forget about this operations room. Forget about the computers. It can't exist, and if it exists, we should all be terrified because this is Big Brother. And this creates the media reception to which then the team and Stafford Beer and everybody else has to respond. And I think to some extent, this misunderstanding explains also why Stafford Beer eventually distances himself from the British society, because it's a radical move of advising the British government, running a big corporation, hanging out with the father of Ghislaine Maxwell, and then basically surrendering it all, selling the Rolls Royce, and living surrounded by Welsh peasants and going to pubs with them in the middle of nowhere in a cottage where he had to go to public toilets 30 miles away from his house to fill his water tanks and carry them in an old Jeep, Land Rover, back to his house. Right? There is clearly a trauma there that I tried to engage with, and I interviewed his daughter and his neighbor in Wales, and many others. But it's a trauma that I still didn't fully understand. But it has to do with this very fluid, ambiguous nature of the project.
And actually, that part of the story, sort of this person from the empire coming to Chile with the idea of solving it and then getting chewed up and spat out again, is very heart of darkness.
I mean, I get into also the British participation in the coup and in the lead up to the coup to some extent, because Stafford Beer, given where he came from, he was really meant to be on the other side. He was meant to be working in Chile, spreading anti-Allende propaganda and trying to basically weaken the Allende government. This is somebody who, by the age of 21, was a staff officer in British intelligence stations in India. He was in the Gurkha Rifles, a very kind of prominent unit with a lot of British imperial history behind it. He had connections to the British Defense Ministry in the 60s. He did a lot of consulting work for them. He was really meant to do a very different kind of intervention in Chile. And this is, I think, partly why the British elite did not forgive him. Because the moment they saw that here was somebody who, from the British military business establishment, went to advise Allende, threw his lot with him, publicly defended Allende in the media, he became really a persona non grata in many of the dinner parties that his brother continued attending. And that's why also the trauma of Stafford Beer was so severe, because ultimately, and this I hinted at in the podcast, Chile does become an important reference point for Britain, but it's not the cybernetic Chile of Allende, it's the Chicago Boys Chile of Pinochet that inspires Margaret Thatcher to implement many of the neoliberal reforms. And worse for Stafford Beer, the guy who's the key bridge between the world of Margaret Thatcher and the world of the Chicago Boys is his former buddy. It's a guy called Alan Walters, a British economist, with whom Stafford Beer had a consulting company in 1971. Right? So one of his business partners becomes essentially an equivalent of what he was doing for Allende, but for Pinochet and Thatcher. Right? And I think the fact that then his own brother became close to Thatcher and was her advisor on educational matters, for Stafford Beer, it was just too much trauma and drama to handle.
And I think the disappointment of someone who had gone with the best of intentions and found himself at the center of this storm, like you described, sort of the media feedback and the loop of misunderstandings that happens, and that I think characterizes a lot of the international coverage of leftist movements in Latin America right now. So it feels very familiar. But yeah, the image of this man who has fallen and gotten chewed up by this entire tragic historical episode is very, very impacting. I think if we want to have questions.
Yeah, let's open up and take a few so that I can answer them at once, hopefully. Does anybody? Yeah.
If people will step up to the microphone at the front. Right here.
It's like facing this way, and it's kind of tall. Do I really need it? I mean,
Because they're recording that.
Oh,
thing is
okay.
the reason.
I guess So yeah, that was a lot, but it was interesting. So I tried to go with it, and it wasn't what I was thinking. Is exactly what she said when you said we were going to go to questions, which was a while ago. She started after you finished, and she mentioned banging on the door with a little girl. See, this is what we need to hear. If you want to know what the drama is, you don't have to make it up. I don't care what kind of person it is. They have to have something. A wife, a kid, a lover, a dog. They put cream in their coffee first before they pour the coffee in. It's how you care about somebody in a movie. Trust me, I spent many years hanging around actors, acting myself, and film festivals. Many years on how to build this. And what you said after technically your talk was over, him coming from this rich family, this needs to be sprinkled. You understand? When you were telling us the story, it needed to be sprinkled.
Well, it's sprinkled in the podcast.
It is.
Sure.
It is. And so that's more of what we need to hear. That's what I wanted to know, because otherwise it's really, you know. And when you give presentations, it would be nice if you sprinkled it in the presentation. You think it's going to take away from the excitement, but it only adds to someone like myself, which may seem very important, being more and more interested.
Sure.
Because I mean, it's a bully. I mean, the internet here came from the government, which came from Europe, from Hedy Lamarr. And they kept it secret for many years. They didn't give her her award. She was so old that her son had to get it while she laid in bed. She was that old. So it's not like we're baba. It happened to us too.
Great. I mean, I can just quickly vary 1-2 sentence response, and then we'll take some more questions. I mean, look, the challenge for me, both today and in the podcast, is how to balance the dramatic with the analytical. Because ultimately, the temptation in a story like this, especially after I've done all the digging for detail and thinking about dramatic narrative and structure, is that, of course, you can tell a fascinating story about a British consultant coming from a rich family, having his life transformed. And I could have told it in a standard way, the way a Hollywood consultant would tell you to write it. So, you know, there is Stafford Beer lying in his pool with Robert Maxwell, receiving a call from Chile, and they invite him to do it. He abandons everything. He gets on a plane, he goes to Chile, discovers it's all not what he wanted, has his life transformed, ends up in a cottage. I could have done it in 4 episodes, following the traditional hero's journey, Campbell methodology that any Hollywood consultant will tell you have to use. I decided not to do that because I thought that for my analytical, own analytical and intellectual work, I have to have more space where I can talk about dependency theory, big tech, relevance of Silicon Valley, the attack that Fernando Flores then carries on artificial intelligence. That's why I started the story with Salvador Allende. If you look at it, it's Salvador Allende winning the Chilean election, and then
Can I get this online somewhere?
the podcast is online. You have 9 episodes. The whole story is online. I guess I'm just saying that there are narrative choices that I had to make in order to make the story workable for me as an intellectual and a historian, that if I were to do it as just a drama person, I would have never made.
You have to have the balance.
Sure, and I hope I did. Sure.
Story, really, the balance comes naturally. Because no human, I don't care how much of a genius that he is, there is that balance.
Sure.
It was in the Apple guy. I mean, I'm not trying to say he's a genius, but every major
Sure.
story, Castro.
Sure.
Come on, Castro's story, his women, his this, his that. This is the balance that happens naturally.
For sure. Well, it took 2 years. So, but yes, I mean, it happens naturally, but you need to have certain elements in place for it to cohere. Thank you.
So, thanks. So it's incredible to see the process behind the product, which is already credible, doubly credible. And it leaves you wanting a part 2. And you already hinted 2 wonderful stories that could be dramatized in a similar way, I guess. One is Stafford Beer's assistant that then worked in the successive governments, but also Fernando Flores, that you didn't speak much about his later life in Silicon Valley.
Sure.
I know that we know our paper you quoted that actually got into an interesting argument. I mean, you're the expert here, I'm certainly not, but that in a way was very momentous in the 80s when artificial intelligence began being discussed as an issue. So there was a feedback, a sort of reflexivity theory in action when suddenly cybersyn became irrelevant, but at the same time, through fate, relevant again in Silicon Valley 10 years later in the 80s. Are you planning a part 2?
So, no, well, in the podcast, and that's why, as I was saying, I had to find a way to continue the story beyond 1973 in the podcast. Like, I can easily imagine that if we were to do a film version of this, the story ends with the coup. So the drama ends there, and then you have a postscript at the end, just saying that Stafford Beer ends up in Wales and Fernando Flores ends up in Silicon Valley. You kind of give an update on what happened to the main characters. I didn't want to do that in the podcast because I knew that intellectually, analytically, like all the interesting stuff, for example, related to Flores, happens in the 80s. And I had to tell that story. And you need to kind of show Stafford Beer living under Thatcherism, and I give this one example where he goes and gives this somewhat unhinged talk at Oxford where he thinks that he'll be arrested afterwards and he keeps drinking wine as he delivers it, right? So I had to insert certain very dramatic elements, and that's why I had to think about, but how do you keep narrative tension in the story, right? That's why the moment I understood that you essentially, after Project Cybersyn, you have an almost equivalent setup technologically that drives Operation Condor. Like, for those of you who don't know, right, it was a way essentially to eliminate Latin American leftists by coordinating the intelligence activities of national security agencies around the region. They used the same setup. They had intelligence agencies connecting via telexes to a central operations room in Buenos Aires, and they had a computer in Santiago where they were storing a lot of the data about the dissidents and the leftists that they were eliminating. The moment I understood that, I got it. Okay, so for an extra episode or two, I can keep the narrative tension because you don't know what happens to Fernando Flores unless you really start from the end of the story, right? The guy is in prison. He spends 3 years there. He's released. Will they eliminate him or not? Right? And you don't know that because they eliminate Orlando Letelier, and I have to introduce him partly as a way to talk about technology and dependency theory, and partly because that allows me to kind of keep some of the intrigue as to what's going to happen to Fernando. Right? So I'm not planning to do anything else podcast-wise on Chile. Believe me, I've had enough. But I am planning to do a follow-up, and maybe more than one, because the overall framework with which I started this, for me, it was thinking about tech rebels that failed, but tech rebels who were honest. They were not like Adam Newman of WeWork or Elizabeth Holmes of Theranos, right? The kind of flakish, shallow tech rebels that were hypocritical, and if you look at them as characters, even in the Apple series that came out, The Dropout or We Crashed, they're completely one-dimensional. All that's driving them is hubris. There's nothing else there, right? If you look at these people, if you look at Beer, if you look at Fernando Flores, they are much more multidimensional real characters who tried, right? And they honestly believed. I mean, they had lots of errors, theoretically, factually, empirically, and they have to be criticized for that. But they were honest, and their utopias crashed. And they crashed for certain reasons that you also need to understand why they crashed. So I have a second story that matches all of those criteria, which I've been working on actually for 9 years now. So not as a podcast, I started it as text and research kind of in the archives and interviews, but it will be a podcast, I hope, soon. Yes. I don't know how much more we can go. I don't know if we ask last question, then if somebody's burning to ask the last question, then we ask. If not, we just finish.
Thank you very much. I hope this is a good last question. You identified one of the missteps of Allende. He hires ITT at one point, and I think to search the office for bugs.
Yeah.
And you've expressed a level of skepticism about technocratic solutions. Do you see any governments? What should the relationship be between a government and technology? A tech giant. Some governments around the world ban American tech giants. Do you have a preferred solution there?
Sure. So I wouldn't give you maybe a direct answer, but an indirect one. One of the big themes in the podcast is this theme and the topic of the dark tech. And for me, dark tech is the way in which technology comes to play a subversive geopolitical role very often in historical events, which we tend to underplay. And ultimately, that's why I show that even well-meaning utopian leftists like Allende, they fundamentally often misunderstood the power of dark tech. So they thought we will use computers and cybernetic methods to better plan the Chilean economy, while the enemies were using technology to spy on Allende, spread propaganda, and like do all sorts of nasty things with it. And later, of course, during Operation Condor, they use it to plan assassinations, right? And so for me, the relationship between governments and tech, I mean, it depends on which governments and which tech, right? But ultimately, what I hope to also indicate was that Allende ITT episode is a certain naivete that a lot of leftists have. They fundamentally think that their enemies are somehow less capable of using technology and they are not as good at mobilizing it, using, for propaganda or surveillance. And I wrote my first book about it, The Net Delusion, which in a sense was an argument about that. It was that we tend to underestimate the ways in which these technologies can be co-opted for very different projects, from the emancipatory one that we celebrated in the Middle East in the early, in 2010s. So in that sense, I think caution is good, and being geopolitically savvy and aware and kind of remembering this dark tech dimension to technologies. And in this day and age, I think, the story of WikiLeaks and Snowden and all of that, to some extent, it brought those themes to the surface. But the solutionist ethos of Silicon Valley with this, very positivistic attitude of technology solving every problem under the sun, I think that distracts us from this dark tech theme as something that we should be working on. Thank you. Thank you so much.